everybody, my name is Pauper Player, and today we are going to be uncasing Grixis Affinity. Usually on this channel we do full-fledged unboxing videos, but I already owned more than half of the cards for this deck, so I went and picked up the remaining singles from my local game store, and now we're just going to be sleeving it up and showing it off. As per usual, we will be using Dragon Shield matte sleeves and keeping our deck in the Ultimate Guard Boulder deck box. So unfortunately today there will be no packing peanuts. Is it really a Pauper Player video? There's no packing peanuts. Now, those of you who have been subscribed to the channel know that I actually uploaded a video on Black-Blue Affinity, but the problem with that video for me is that I labeled it as traditional Affinity, but I added a bunch of jank cards that I wanted to play into it. So it didn't feel right to me that if a new person were to come onto this channel and look up Affinity, that they would see my jank list instead of the traditional Affinity list. I'm one of the people that's adamant that you should always play cards that you want to play, and I still stand by that, but I wanted to give you guys a true deck tech on Grixis Affinity. So before we get into the deck, let's go ahead and talk about what Affinity is. Affinity is a mechanic that will reduce the cost of spells based on the number of permanents that your card has Affinity for. For example here, Frogmite is a 4-mana 2/2 artifact creature that has Affinity for artifacts. This spell costs 1 less to play for each artifact you control. Let's say on turn 1 you play your Vault of Whispers, which is an artifact land. Because you now have an artifact on the field, Frogmite now costs 1 less to cast, meaning that he only costs 3 mana. Now let's say on your second turn you play another Vault of Whispers. Now you have 2 artifacts on the field, and Frogmite now only costs 2 mana. So you could tap these 2 and play Frogmite. Now I'm going to finish off this example with our other main Affinity card, Mirror Enforcer, which is a 7-mana 4/4 with Affinity for artifacts. So let's say this is in our hand, and on our third turn we untap and play a third artifact land. Now we have 4 artifacts on the field. Mirror Enforcer costs 7 mana, so 7 minus 4 equals 3. We could tap the 3 mana and play our 4/4 on our third turn. So although playing a creature with 4 power 4 toughness on turn 3 doesn't seem that crazy, this deck has a lot of really cheap artifacts that allow you to dump your entire hand within the first 2 turns of the game. With that being said, we are running 4 copies of Frogmite and 4 copies of Mirror Enforcer. Next up on the list we have Kenku Artificer, which costs 3 mana, a blue and 2 colorless. When Kenku Artificer enters the battlefield, put 3 1/1 counters on up to 1 target non-artifact creature. That artifact becomes a 0/0 homunculus artifact creature with flying. So usually making your artifact a 3/3 flyer isn't actually all that good, because now not only does it die to artifact removal, but it also dies to creature removal. Unless you're playing artifacts that are indestructible. This deck is playing 9 indestructible artifact dual lands, 3 copies of Mistvault Bridge, 2 copies of Silverbluff Bridge, and then 4 copies of Drawsforge Bridge. Now indestructible means that the card cannot be destroyed, and in the case of an artifact creature, indestructible also means that they will not die during combat damage. Now there's only 2 ways you can kill an indestructible creature, either by making an opponent sacrifice it or by exiling it. Hello, this is Ed and Joel. I just wanted to let you all know that I lied and that there are actually 3 ways to kill an indestructible creature, and that third way is by reducing its toughness to 0 with cards like Defile. Anyways, that's all. I just thought I'd throw that in there. Now every single white deck in Pauper plays a card called Dust to Dust exclusively because of Kenku Artificer. Dust to Dust is a 3-mana sorcery that costs 2 white and 1 colorless that will allow the opponent to exile 2 artifacts. That card is currently the only card in Pauper that effectively deals with Kenku Artificer and the indestructible artifact lands. Anyway, so next up on the list we have Gearseeker's Serpent, which is a 5/6 creature that costs 7 mana, 2 blue and 5 colorless. Gearseeker's Serpent costs 1 less to cast for each artifact you control. This card also has, if you pay 5 mana and a blue, Gearseeker's Serpent can't be blocked this turn. Now this effect is exactly the same as Affinity for artifacts. The only reason why it doesn't say that is because Gearseeker's Serpent was printed in Kaladesh, and Kaladesh didn't have Affinity as its main mechanic. But the good thing about this card is that it's not an artifact in itself, so it won't die to artifact removal. We are running 1 copy of Gearseeker's Serpent and 1 copy of Gurmag Angler. If you've played Magic the Gathering for a while, or you've played Pauper for a while, you know this card. It is a 7 mana black and 6 colorless 5/5 zombie fish creature with Delve. Delve means that each card you exile from your graveyard while casting the spell pays for 1. This deck runs a lot of spells and artifacts that you're casting and sacrificing, so it will not be hard to get 6 cards into your graveyard. And when you do have 6 cards in your graveyard, you can exile all of them, and then Gurmag Angler is a 5/5 for 1 mana. This is extremely strong. In fact, it's so strong that there's an entire entire tier 1 deck based around it. So we are running one copy of him just as an additional big creature that comes out a little differently than, you know, just through our artifacts. So next up on the list is one of our main win conditions, Makeshift Munitions, which is a red and a colorless enchantment. Pay 1 to sacrifice an artifact or creature. Makeshift Munitions deals 1 damage to any target. So this card's extremely good because towards the end of the game, when we've built up a really big board and we either need to finish off our opponent or maybe take down some of our opponent's smaller creatures, we can tap our artifact lands to pay for the sacrifice cost and also sacrifice that artifact land. Or you could sacrifice cards like Eager Wellspring that when it leaves a battlefield, you draw a card. So you pay 1 mana to activate Makeshift Munitions, sacrifice Eager Wellspring. Now you get to deal 1 damage to any target and you also get to draw a card. This deck also creates a bunch of artifact tokens like Blood Fountain and Deadly Dispute, and you could sacrifice those tokens to Makeshift Munitions as well. So there's actually one card in this deck that I don't have at the moment that I wasn't able to find on time as of the making of this video, and that card is Crack Clan Shaman. Crack Clan Shaman is a 1 red mana creature that when you sacrifice an artifact, Crack Clan Shaman deals 1 damage to each creature without flying. Typically speaking in Grixis Affinity, you'd be playing 2 copies of Makeshift Munitions and then the 1 copy of Crack Clan Shaman. But for the time being, we have 3 copies, and next up we have Eager Wellspring. Now we're going to be getting into the gas of the deck. Eager Wellspring is a 2 mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield or is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, draw a card. Obviously, we have a couple different cards in this deck that sacrifice artifacts, but the best card that we have in this deck that works with Eager Wellspring is going to be Deadly Dispute. Deadly Dispute is a black and a colorless instant that says, as an additional cost to cast a spell, sacrifice an artifact or a creature. Draw 2 cards and create a treasure token. The reason why Deadly Dispute in this deck is so good is not only because it draws you 2 cards, but it replaces that artifact with a treasure token. So it allows you to draw 2 cards without affecting your affinity count. And then when you pair it up with a card like Eager Wellspring, when you sacrifice Eager Wellspring, this draws you a card, you draw 2 cards from Deadly Dispute, and you create a treasure, which is just insane value. So the one important thing about Deadly Dispute that I want to point out is how it says as an additional cost to cast this spell, you sacrifice an artifact or creature. The reason why this is important is because you need to sacrifice that artifact at the same time you're tapping your mana. Your opponent countering Deadly Dispute does not mean that you don't sacrifice an artifact or a creature. The correct way to play Deadly Dispute is you say, I'm going to tap 2 lands, 1 black, and I'm going to sacrifice my artifact in order to cast Deadly Dispute. In this instance, Eager Wellspring drawing you a card from leaving the battlefield will go on the stack. Now your opponent can respond by casting Counterspell, countering Deadly Dispute, and then your Eager Wellspring trigger will resolve and allowing you to draw a card. This is so important because a lot of people will tap 2 mana and play Deadly Dispute, and then the opponent will Counterspell it, and then they'll just resolve everything and no artifact got sacrificed. So unfortunately, as an Affinity player, if you're behind in a game and you decide to take the risk by using Deadly Dispute on your artifact land and somebody counters it, you still have to sacrifice your artifact land even though Deadly Dispute didn't resolve and you don't get to draw those cards. And this is extremely important for every player that's playing against somebody who's using Deadly Dispute. If you get overzealous and counterspell your opponent's Deadly Dispute before they sacrifice their permanent, they now know that they're not going to get any of the benefits from Deadly Dispute, so they may change what they were originally going to sacrifice. And you can't dispute them on that because you'll have no evidence of what their original sacrifice target was. The point is, if you're playing Deadly Dispute or if your opponent is playing Deadly Dispute, they are supposed to sacrifice their artifact or their creature at the same time they are tapping their mana to play Deadly Dispute. Anyways, we're playing 4 copies of Eager Wellspring, 4 copies of Deadly Dispute, and 2 copies of Reckoner's Bargain, which costs the exact same as Deadly Dispute, which is a black, a colorless, and a sacrificed artifact or creature. But this card, you gain life equal to the sacrifice permanent's mana value, draw 2 cards. So for example, if we targeted our Mirror Enforcer's mana value is 7, so we would gain 7 life. We are running 2 copies of those. Next up, we have Thoughtcast, which costs 5 mana, a blue and 4 colorless, affinity for artifacts, draw 2 cards. So this is important. Affinity only counts for the colorless part of a card's mana cost. So even if you have 5 artifacts on the field, you will still have to pay the blue mana and Thoughtcast's mana cost. We are playing 4 copies of that. Next up, we have Blood Fountain, which is a 1 black mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, create a blood token. Blood tokens are an artifact that says, for 1 mana, tap it, discard, sacrifice this artifact, draw draw a card. That is right here. And then Blood Fountain also says for a black and 3 colorless, tap it, sacrifice Blood Fountain, return up to 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand. So if you're going against burn and you decide to Reckoner's Bargain your Mirror Enforcer to gain 7 life, you can then sacrifice the Blood Fountain in order to bring the Mirror Enforcer back to your hand. Blood Fountain's also just really good because on turn 1 it creates 2 artifacts with our artifact land. On turn 2 we could start dropping a bunch of Frogmites and Mirror Enforcers for free because it just amps up our artifact count. So we're playing 3 copies of those. So next up we're playing Metallic Rebuke, which is a 3 mana instant, a blue and 2 colorless with Improvise. Counter target spell unless its controller pays 3. And Improvise is your artifacts can help cast a spell. Each artifact you tap after you're done activating mana abilities pays for 1. So this is not the same as Affinity. Let's say on turn 1 you played a Blood Fountain and you have a blood token on the field. On turn 2 your opponent plays a spell and you want to counter it. So you can actually tap your Blood Fountain and your blood token using Improvise and then pay the 1 blue mana to cast this for basically just 1 blue mana. 99% of the time it is a 1 blue mana counter spell that makes your opponent pay 3, and we are playing 4 copies of these. Finally, for the spells in this list, we have Galvanic Blast. For 1 red mana, it's an instant that deals 2 damage to any creature or player. It also has Metalcraft, which means that it will do 4 damage instead if you control 3 or more artifacts. In this deck specifically, outside of the very first turn of the game, we will always have more than 3 artifacts on the field, so this will always be doing 4 damage, which means in this deck specifically, this card is better than Lightning Bolt. And finally, we have the land base. So we are running 3 Great Furnace, which is the red artifact land. We are running 3 Vault of Whispers, which is the black artifact land. And we are running 2 Seat of Synods, which is the blue artifact land. Now, just a brief reminder for maybe the 1 or 2 people that don't know this, but these do not count as basic lands. These are not basic artifact lands. These are just regular artifact lands. If your opponent plays a card that allows you to go look for a basic land, you cannot grab these. These are not basic lands. We do, however, have 2 basic lands in the form of 1 single swamp and 1 single island. And then finally, for a total of 19 lands, we have all of the indestructible artifact bridges, which we talked about earlier with Kenku Artificer. Like I said, we have 4 copies of Dross Forge Bridge, we have 2 copies of Spire Bluff Bridge, and then we have 3 copies of Mist Vault Bridge. So now let's get into the sideboard. First up, we have 3 copies of Pyroblast, which is a 1 red mana instant. Counter target spell if it is blue, or destroy target permanent if it's blue. Literally all this is an answer to blue counter decks. Next up we have Hydroblast, which is a blue mana instant that counters target red spell or destroys target red permanent. The reason why we're running 4 copies of Hydroblast is because red decks are very, very popular and very strong right now, so being able to deal with them is really important. Next up we have Dispel, which is a 1 blue mana instant that just counters a target instant spell. Believe it or not, there are decks that play instant spells that aren't blue and red, so that's why we have 1 copy of that. Next up, we have 1 copy of Nihil Spellbomb, which is a 1 mana artifact. When you tap it, you could sacrifice it to exile all cards from target player's graveyard. And when Nihil Spellbomb is put into the graveyard from battlefield, you may pay a black mana if you do draw a card. This card's pretty much only in the deck for blue-black terror. If your opponent is dumping a bunch of cards in their graveyard, you can just sacrifice this and exile all of them. Next up, we have 1 copy of Unexpected Fangs, which is a black and a colorless instant, put a 1/1 counter and a lifelink counter on target creature. This is for burn and aggro decks. Play Kenku Artificer on your indestructible artifact land, and then use this on that same indestructible artifact land. And now that artifact land is a 4/4 with flying, indestructible, and lifelink. Your opponent can't kill it, and you just gain 4 life every time you attack or block. It's pretty good. Next up, we have Echoing Decay, which is a black and a colorless instant. Target creature and all other creatures with the same name as that creature get -2/-2 until end of turn. Now, you could play Arms of Hadar, which is technically a better card, but it costs 1 extra mana. And then finally, we are playing 3 Diabolic Edicts. I've said it once, and I'll say it again. I prefer this card over Chainer's Edict because Diabolic Edict is at instant speed. Whatever pump spells they want, whatever protection spells they want, it doesn't matter. But then before they attack, I will play a Diabolic Edict and they will cry, and we are running 3 copies of these. And that is going to be Grixis Affinity for Pauper. If you guys enjoyed this deck, make sure to check it out down in the description below. And while you're down there, press the subscribe button, because in the next couple weeks, we're going to be opening up Boros Synthesizer, Mono Blue Tempo, and then Coggates. So yeah, go ahead and press the subscribe button. Thank you guys so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.